Ocarina of Time is a revolutionary game that completely shook the video game industry at its core back in the day, along with everything else that every single person who makes a video on Ocarina of Time on the internet has said 10,000 times before because I'm so original. Regardless, I adore the game, and one of the biggest reasons why is because of the game's fantastic level design. The jump to 3D really helped make Ocarina's dungeons distinct and memorable in comparison to the previous games, although nothing will beat Link's Awakening's multiple shades of green. It's impossible. Don't even try. From the sticky bowels of Jabu Jabu's belly, to the ancient chanting in the Fire Temple, to the blood and guillotines in the Shadow Temple, each area feels unique. Today, I will be covering what I think is the most memorable part of Ocarina of Time. Not just because of its atmosphere, but also because of its interesting level design, and what I consider to be the formula for the perfect Zelda dungeon. So hi, I'm Mallow, this is What Makes a Game, and let's talk about the Forest Temple. Or actually, let's not. Because in order to understand why the Forest Temple is so beloved, we need to understand what makes a Zelda dungeon fun to play through. What exactly separates a good dungeon from a boring one? To illustrate my point, I've decided to use Turtle Rock, Link's Awakening's final main dungeon, as an example. The dungeon begins by giving us 3 different paths to go down from the word go, and what's interesting is that none of them are dead ends. The left path leads to 2 mini-bosses, a key, and the compass. The top path leads to the main room of the dungeon that has hallways that branch out and lead to a bunch of keys, and the right path leads to a ton of rooms that eventually lead to the key item. Because of this branching structure, the player is given many different choices on how to approach the dungeon. From my count, the player can get the compass, map, stone beak, 4 locked doors, and 5 keys the second the player enters the dungeon in any order. So Turtle Rock is super non-linear, which is a huge plus. It allows the player to approach the dungeon in any way they see fit, and it tests the player's spatial awareness. Another thing that Link's Awakening does well, and is required to make a good Zelda dungeon in my eyes, is using the key item properly. Turtle Rock does this in many fantastic ways, by blocking paths with ice that you cannot melt and torches that you cannot light. That is, until you get the magical rod, which allows you to melt the ice and light the torches. And by using the item, Link's Awakening can open up a second phase of the dungeon, where you need to backtrack to previously blocked areas using the new item. The areas that you need to backtrack to are memorable and stick out, like this ice-covered tunnel, or the room full of torches. Because of this, they stay in your head until you need to return. Once you get the magic rod, the player can then find 1 more key, open 2 locked doors, and get the boss key, and then fight the boss, ending the dungeon. Using Turtle Rock as an example, we can create some criteria that can be used to see what type of dungeon each Zelda dungeon is from each Zelda game. There's 3 different types of Zelda dungeons, the ones which are made up of locks and keys and have plenty of different ways to go and paths branching out. Let's call this type of dungeon a non-linear dungeon. How creative. The next type of dungeon is one that is more straightforward and based almost entirely on combat and simple puzzles. Let's call this type of dungeon a straightforward dungeon. The third and final type of dungeon is the kind of dungeons that manipulate the space itself, where the actual dungeon itself is the puzzle. This can be manipulating water, or raising a giant pillar, or flipping the temple itself upside down. We'll call this dungeon a non-linear puzzle box type dungeon. Many people consider these types of dungeons to be the most annoying, but personally, I think they're some of the best if handled correctly. With these categories in mind, we can ask ourselves a few questions to categorize each Zelda dungeon into one of these 3. Question 1. Does the dungeon have any backtracking, either with keys and locked doors or with the key item? This can be used to judge the dungeon's linearity, as more linear dungeons will obviously have little to no backtracking. Question 2. Does the player have a choice when it comes to keys and locks? This can be either with actual keys and locked doors, or metaphorical keys like the balls in Link's Awakening or the dungeon's key item. Basically what this means is there something that unlocks more things? For example, raising the water levels in order to access different parts of the dungeon. Question 3. Does the dungeon have any manipulation of the space inside of it? The messy question aside, this is primarily used to figure out if a dungeon is in the 3rd category, as a non-linear puzzle box dungeon will have manipulation of the space inside the dungeon. Question 4. Is backtracking required, and if so, is it done for the player? There are a few Zelda dungeons, mainly from Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Minish Cap, that either don't require backtracking at all, or when they do, it's done for the player. A great example of this is in the Wind Waker's Earth Temple, where instead of having to return to previous areas after getting the Mirror Shield, there's a shortcut directly to the main room where you need to use it. This hinders the use of the player's spatial awareness and makes for a pretty boring dungeon. I'm going to guess that plenty of you are curious about why I'm asking so many questions about backtracking, and the answer is quite simple, actually. Zelda dungeons test something that video games rarely test: your spatial awareness. You actually need to think about what keys go where and when to use the key item after you obtain it. Outside of Metroidvanias and some 3D platformers like Banjo-Tooie and Yooka-Laylee, video games do not test you on that skill, and that's sad. But this isn't a video about the modern games industry, so let's talk about Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple. The Forest Temple is the 4th dungeon you explore in Ocarina of Time, and the first dungeon you explore as Adult Link. This dungeon is actually quite different from other dungeons in many ways, although we can still use the criteria I made earlier to analyze it. To start, the Forest Temple doesn't use the usual formula of find keys to get to the item to get to the boss key to then fight the boss. You actually get the boss key super early in the level, right after you get the key item. So the challenge isn't finding the boss key, but getting to the boss door, which requires fighting 4 mini-bosses, which will light the torches in the central room and make an elevator leading down to the boss room. I really like this change, as you have a larger goal in the dungeon that isn't as simple as just getting to the boss room. This is something Ocarina of Time's dungeons do very well, for example, knocking down the pillar in the Fire Temple. This dungeon is also very eerie and atmospheric, with a haunting soundtrack and the N64's god-awful draw distance being used to surprisingly good effect. The switch to the 3rd dimension in Ocarina of Time also helped to create some great puzzles in the Forest Temple, as well as all of Ocarina's other dungeons. The most memorable puzzle to me was this one, where you need to shoot an arrow through a torch in order to melt a block of ice. Along with the puzzles being better, Ocarina's dungeons could experiment with many different ideas. The Forest Temple has hallways that twist around and allow you to walk on the walls. This would be near impossible to convey in 2D and makes the dungeon so much more interesting and causes you to think before you change the hallways from twisted to straight, as that changes which rooms you can access. Now that we know about the Forest Temple, we can categorize it with the system I made earlier. Let's get to the questions. Does the dungeon have any backtracking? Yes, there are several points where you need to return to previous areas to get one of the Poes, a small key, and the boss key. Does the player have any choice when it comes to keys and locks? Yes, there are several points in the dungeon where the player has many different keys to obtain. However, each locked door is just behind another locked door, which makes the choice of keys not as interesting, as opposed to Turtle Rock, which gives you many different parts of the dungeon which you can access with many different keys and many different locked doors all at once. Does the dungeon have any manipulation of space in the dungeon? Yes, kind of. As I mentioned earlier, the Forest Temple has these twisting hallways that allow access to different rooms, but I don't consider that enough for the dungeon to be considered a non-linear puzzle box dungeon, as the dungeon doesn't necessarily revolve entirely around it. Does the dungeon require backtracking, and if so, does it do the backtracking for you? Yes. The Forest Temple requires backtracking, and no, it doesn't do the backtracking for you. There are a few optional items like arrows that require backtracking, but for the most part, backtracking is required to make progress in the dungeon. So yeah, the Forest Temple is a fantastic dungeon in Ocarina of Time, and is, in my eyes, a perfect Zelda dungeon. I'd love to talk about other Zelda dungeons while using the criteria I made here. I'd love to see how I can classify dungeons from games like The Minish Cap or Wind Waker. What would the dungeons in A Link Between Worlds look like, where the items are obtained outside of the dungeons? I hope everyone else is also excited. If this series continues, I'll be comparing my favorite and least favorite dungeons in Ocarina of Time to see what makes a 3D Zelda dungeon interesting and memorable. I will see you all next time. Thank you for watching. Hey there, thanks for watching. This is obviously an experimental idea, and I don't know if I'm going to continue or not. You can follow me on Twitter for news on other videos, and maybe if this does decently, I'll make it an actual series. I also have a large amount of bloopers and editing mistakes and all that garbage, so if you want to see that, I'm going to put them at the end of this video in a second. So, until then, thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. The Forest Temple is the first dungeon you explore. Yeah, fuck the Deku Tree, right? Find keys to get the item, to get to the boss key, to get then fight. The get fight. I like to get fight. My favorite part of any Zelda dungeon is to get fight. Now that we have a way to... I stopped myself from saying it correctly. I was just in the zone, very professional. You actually get the boss key super early in the level, right after you defeat the key item. That's a new one. Whoa, top 10 mini bosses. Jesus Christ. The dungeon begins. This is the third word of the sentence. Word number What does that even mean? The dungeon begins.